Thank you all. It's a pleasure to see you. Welcome you to this year's Hilda B. Silverman lecture. Tomorrow, May 5th, will be the 10th anniversary of Hilda's death. For me, as for many others, it is difficult to conceive that an entire decade has passed since Hilda left us. Her impact remains powerful, deeply felt, and immediate. There are so many times when I desperately want to speak with her, and I know she would be so pleased and grateful for your presence and participation here today. Before I begin my introduction of Professor Klug, I must thank the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard and the superlative administrative staff and faculty for their ongoing support and sponsorship of this lecture. I want to single out Professor William Granaro, the director of the CMES, Elizabeth Flanagan, the CMES events coordinator, and Eric Edstam, the CMES communications coordinator, all of whom contribute so much to making this lectureship an ongoing success. Now, I'd like to begin with a now famous Hilda story, told by the late Edward Said in his book, Culture and Resistance. Edward wrote, and I quote, "It was 1988. There was a Tikkun conference in New York. I and my friend Ibrahim Abu-Lugod were on a panel with Michael Walzer. At one point, in a moment of exasperation, Walzer said, quote, 'All right, you're going to get your state, so I think it's important to stop thinking about the past. You go have your state, we'll have ours, and that's the end of it.' At which point, a woman in the audience, who I never forgot, her name was Hilda Silverman, got up in a state of rage, railing at Walzer, saying, 'How dare you tell a Palestinian that he should stop reminding us of the past when you and I belong to a people that is always reminding the world of how much we suffered and asking people never to forget. How dare you tell a Palestinian to forget?'" End quote. Remembrance and the role of memory in repairing a broken world was an informing and pivotal theme in Hilda's activism, as important for Palestinians, she believed, as for Jews. It is therefore an honor to introduce Professor Brian Klug, whose corpus of work addresses issues that were close to Hilda's heart and mind: anti-Semitism, old and new, Judaism and Zionism, justice and human rights. His research, which informs his political activism, focuses in particular on Judaism, not least in the context of Arab-Jewish relations and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Drawing on resources within Judaism itself, Professor Klug's academic work has, over time, extended from philosophy to other disciplines in the humanities and social sciences. Brian Klug received a PhD in social thought from the University of Chicago. He is a senior research fellow in philosophy at St. Benet's Hall at the University of Oxford and a member of Oxford's Faculty of Philosophy. He also holds the position of honorary fellow at the Parks Institute for the Study of Jewish/non-Jewish Relations at the University of Southampton in the UK, and is a fellow of the College of Arts and Sciences at St. Xavier University in Chicago, where he was chair of the Department of Philosophy. In 2012, he was a visiting scholar at the International Center for Muslim and Non-Muslim Understanding at the University of South Australia in Adelaide, among many other international appointments. Professor Klug has many books, articles, chapters, and essays published internationally, far too many for me to enumerate. I shall read just some of his titles, which will give you an idea of the range and depth of his thinking and research. His books include Words of Fire, Selected Essays of Ahad Ha'am, Being Jewish and Doing Justice, Bringing Argument to Life, Offense, The Jewish Case, A Time to Speak Out, Independent Jewish Voices on Israel, Zionism, and Jewish Identity, where he was co-editor, and Children as Equals, Exploring the Rights of the Child, also as co-editor. Here are some titles of his essays. An Emblematic Embrace, The New Europe, Anti-Semitism and the Palestinians. Moses, the Significant Other. Anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. Am I White? Revisiting the Legacy of Race. Zionism, Binationalism, Anti-Semitism, 3 contemporary Jewish readings of the Balfour Declaration. The Limits of Analogy, comparing Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. A Higher Road to Peace, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the battle for Judaism. And The Myth of the New Anti-Semitism. 2 of Professor Klug's publications that are forthcoming are The Medieval Roots of Anti-Semitism, due out this year, and Contemporary Engagements with Arab and Jewish Questions, Interrogating National Identity and Political Sovereignty, which is scheduled for 2019. Dr. Klug is working closely with the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights in Vienna, especially on human rights and religion. For several years, he was attached to the Bruno Kreisky Forum for International Dialogue, an Austrian think tank participating in 2 projects: Vienna Conversations on the Missing Sense of Togetherness in Europe, and Arab-Jewish Engagement, a biannual roundtable of Jewish and Arab academics and writers. In 2007, a group of British Jews, Dr. Klug among them, founded Independent Jewish Voices, which is still going strong. Brian Klug is also an associate editor of the journal Patterns of Prejudice and a member of the international advisory boards of 2 other academic journals, Reorient, the Journal of Critical Muslim Studies, and Islamophobia Studies Yearbook. He is on the advisory board for Negotiating Jewish Identity, Jewish Life in 21st Century Norway, a research project of the Center for the Studies of Holocaust and Religious Minorities based in Oslo. Dr. Klug has spoken at many universities, foundations, and research institutes around the world, including Austria, Australia, Belgium, Germany, Canada, Hungary, Ireland, Israel, Italy, Sweden, and Turkey. In January of this year, he gave the annual Holocaust Memorial Day lecture at the University of Cambridge. And in 2013, he gave the public lecture at the Jewish Museum Berlin on the 75th anniversary of Kristallnacht. The lecture was entitled, "What Do We Mean When We Say Anti-Semitism? Echoes of Shattering Glass." I'd like to conclude this introduction with an excerpt from that lecture, and I quote, "There are numerous dots with different names: racism, anti-Semitism, xenophobia, Islamophobia, homophobia, and so on. There is also the dot that consists in demonizing an individual for political purposes, distorting their work, misrepresenting their views, maligning their character, constructing them as someone they are not. Each dot is unique in its own way. Each word that names each dot matters in its own right. But it also matters as part of a lexicon of bigotry. In other words, anti-Semitism points beyond itself. It points to the myriad forms that bigotry can take. If when we say anti-Semitism, we do not join the dots, then do we really know what the word means? Are our ears sufficiently attuned to the echoes of shattering glass? So please join me in welcoming Brian Klug.
Thank you, Sarah, for that introduction. Thank you all for that welcome. I say thank you, but I feel a bit lost for words, and I'm not sure that that's the condition that a speaker should be in just before he gives a talk. However, fortunately, I have written this talk out because I wanted to come today and to present as carefully considered a case as I could, looking back over the 15 years or so in which I've been publishing and speaking on this subject. So I'm going to read out a script, and it'll probably take about an hour to read, but I'll try not to interrupt myself. So thank you, Sarah, for inviting me to give this lecture, and for much else besides, for priceless conversations over the years, despite being on opposite shores of a rather large pond, for making sure that I, along with the other people on your email distribution list, never suffer from being ill-informed, and for your pioneering work on de-development in Gaza and other areas. If, as the title of my talk suggests, if I forget the O Jerusalem, the use and abuse of Jewish memory, if this title suggests that I will focus on Jerusalem, it is with an eye to Gaza. Jerusalem and Gaza, heading for a head-on collision this very month, with the US Embassy move to Jerusalem officially opening on Yom HaAtzmaut, May the 14th, and Gaza's March of Return reaching a crescendo the following day, Nakba Day. Jerusalem and Gaza, both places that are more than just places. Both represent something more general. With Gaza, it is straightforward. Gaza stands for the dispossession of the Palestinians by the State of Israel. As for Jerusalem, the question of what it stands for is a mite more complex. Analyzing this complexity and the bearing it has on the theory and practice of political Zionism will be at the heart of my talk. Actually, Sarah, you remind me of someone I never met, but whom I am beginning to think I did, especially after hearing your introduction, and certainly wish I had, Hilda Silverman. It was while I was preparing this talk that I began to get to know her, partly through things that other people say about her, and partly through her own words. So much so that I want to take this opportunity, there might not be another, to address her directly. So, Hilda, if I may, I'm going to quote from an op-ed you contributed to the Philadelphia Inquirer 16 years ago. I owe knowledge of this op-ed to Alice Rothschild's eloquent tribute to you in the Jewish Women's Archive. I am a Jew, this is what you said, with a profound consciousness of Jewish victimization through history. But for me, you added straight away, victim and victimizer, oppressor and oppressed are not mutually exclusive categories. If I understand you correctly, your point is that these words denote different roles, not different groups. No group is essentially victim or victimizer, oppressor or oppressed. Any group can at different times be the one or the other. The implication is this: the fact that Jews have been oppressed in the past does not mean that Jews cannot oppress others in the present. In the context of my talk, which is about the use and abuse of Jewish memory, this is what I hear you, Hilda, saying. Remembering that Jews have been oppressed and acknowledging that Jews oppress others, specifically Palestinians, are not mutually exclusive. Actually, I think you were saying rather more than this. They are mutually inclusive. Remembering the one must mean acknowledging the other, for oppression is indivisible. Unless I am mistaken, this must, for you, is a human imperative, but also a Jewish imperative. Precisely, you speak for me too. I rather wish you could continue to speak for me tonight. It would take a load off my shoulders and everyone here would love to hear from you. But in the circumstances, I'll do my best to stand in. In the extract that I just read from her op-ed, Hilda spoke in the first person singular. I am a Jew, but for me. I shall follow suit. I shall speak in the same voice as she did, my own. And while Sarah has already introduced me more than amply, there is a little bit that I want to add by way of introducing the voice in which I am speaking. I am neither Palestinian nor Israeli, but in speaking about the subject tonight, I speak from the inside. The state of Israel is about to turn 70, and I am not far behind. I grew up with Israel and Zionism in my life. They were present in my childhood home, an observant household in a Jewish community in northwest London, and in the Orthodox Jewish school that I attended from the age of 5 to 18. Palestine, in a sense, was present also, but the two names, Palestine and Israel, were interchangeable at the time. The Joint Palestine Appeal, JPA, was a Zionist charity that raised money for Israel. We had a box in our house. And looking back, I realized with a shudder what this signified, the total appropriation of Palestine by Israel as a Jewish state. Something rendered invisible to me at the time by my environment. And this, by the way, demonstrates a positive use of memory, recognizing as adults the habits of mind that are implanted in us in childhood, the convictions we imbibe by osmosis from parents, aunts, uncles, and the whole host of grown-ups around us. Bringing these convictions to consciousness articulating the collective unconscious, so to speak, of the group to which we belong. This is what we need to do in order to know our own minds, to know which convictions, if any, we own and which we disown. Only thus do we acquire a voice of our own. Now, to be fair, there are certain things we learn when we are young that can actually be helpful. Sometimes it's a matter of the order in which we learn them. So the Hebrew that I learnt to read and write as a young child, I learnt it at the same time as I learnt to read and write English, was classical Hebrew, not Ivrit. As a result, Jerusalem first entered my consciousness through the Tanakh, or Hebrew scriptures, also known as the Old Testament, and through Jewish liturgy. Jerusalem established itself there in my mind as a city of the book before I read about it in newspapers. Now, admittedly, it could have worked out differently, as it has for many Jews with a somewhat similar background to mine. It has contributed to conflating poetic word with factual world. And what I mean by this will become clearer, I hope, as my talk progresses. But in my case, my early Jewish education has given me a degree of critical distance, for which I am thankful, or at least it has in the long run. It has helped me to think about the rhetoric of political Zionism, about the very word Zionism, and the difference made to Zion when it is turned into an ism. In essence, I see the adding of the ism as an act of violence against the word Zion, when it is turned into an ism. I'm sorry, I lost my place there. I see the adding of the ism as an act of violence against the word Zion, a kind of verbal omen of the physical violence that was to come in the name of Zion, bearing in mind that Zion in the Bible is another name for Jerusalem, and by extension, the whole of Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. Not that I shall expatiate on the scriptural dimension of this theme tonight. This is not, after all, a seminar on Judaism, as Sarah gently reminded me when inviting me to give this talk. I mention all this only in order, as I said, to introduce the voice in which I am speaking. The same voice Hilda used in her op-ed, the first person singled out. I, as in, I am a Jew. In short, my talk is by way of being a personal reflection or meditation, and meditation is not a science. Like Socrates, I shall follow a thought wherever it might lead, even if it takes me on a tangent. I am not coming from the front line of scholarly research to present the latest findings in my field. I don't really have a field. While I shall venture into the territory of history, politics, and the Middle East, I am a rank amateur. I am not a historian, a political scientist, or an expert on the Middle East. I am not an expert on anything. I am the opposite of an expert. I am a philosopher. As a philosopher, the only thing worth knowing that I know is that I know nothing worth knowing. And I have, of course, lifted this paradox from the speech that Socrates made at his trial in Plato's Apology, so he's the one who deserves the laugh. It was the basic premise of Socrates' compelling defense against charges that portrayed him as a know-it-all. Not that the Athenians found his argument compelling, they showed their respect for logic by condemning Socrates to death. I hope to get off a little lighter this evening. They made him drink hemlock. I'll settle for a glass of Merlot. The subject of my talk tonight is memory. It's funny how you take an interest in something only when you start to lose it, sometimes. But what interests me about memory is not so much the mere having or losing of it as its use and abuse. It is good for everyone to be able to forget, remarked Ernest Renan in his lecture on the nature of a nation. Forgetting, he observed, is an essential factor in the creation of a nation. In a somewhat similar vein, Brian Friel, the late Irish dramatist, said, "To remember everything is a form of madness." Well, I dare say that is true, and it's one of the consolations of creeping oblivion as one gets older. But there is also a form of madness, for nations and for individuals, that comes with selective memory. For it is not only the past that can be forgotten. A priori amnesia, pre-selecting what we remember, filtering out what does not fit our template, can make us sort of psychotic, out of touch with reality, oblivious to the here and now, blind to what is in front of our eyes. which prompts the question, can we remember the past without forgetting the present? Recalling Hilda's words, can we as Jews remember Jewish victimization through history without forgetting the victimization of Palestinians today? The complicated relationship between Jewish memory and Jewish forgetfulness in the context of political Zionism. This is the subject of my talk. When I speak about memory, I mean this: how we inherit the past, how we internalize it, both individually and collectively. In the Jewish case, remembering is itself a significant item in the past that we inherit, as Harold Bloom reminds us in his foreword to Yerushalmi's book, Zakor, Jewish History and Jewish Memory. Bloom explains that, and I quote him, Zakor is the verb used throughout the Hebrew Bible whenever Israel is admonished, remember. Now, I do not need to remind us that Israel here is not the modern state, but the ancient people, Am Yisrael, the people of Israel, the Israelites, whose career is narrated in successive books of the Tanakh. Some people, however, most definitely do need to be reminded of this. They're forgetting the difference between the biblical people and the people today is at the heart of the problem that is my subject. In the preface to the 1989 edition of his book, Yerushalmi explains his distinction between Jewish history and Jewish memory. Roughly, history for him is, in his words, the actual recording and interpretation of historical events, while memory is the consciousness we have of that history. How it inhabits the mind is how I would put it. The fact that the modern state bears the name Israel is evidence of how the biblical people inhabits the mind of the state. It signifies that the state has in some sense internalized the biblical narrative. Moreover, the state, as the political expression of Zionism, has nationalized Jewish memory, including the way we remember the injunction, remember, don't forget. What happens to this injunction when it is nationalized? That is the subject of my talk. If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, says Psalm 137, let my right hand forget. This is what the Hebrew says literally, though usually translations add its cunning, its function, its skill, or something of the sort. But what does it mean to not forget Jerusalem? Or to put it differently, what is involved in not forgetting this verse, the verse in Psalm 137 that speaks about not forgetting Jerusalem? And not this verse alone, but other verses in other psalms and other books in the Tanakh that place a premium on remembering. Be it Zion, slavery in Egypt, the code of ethics on which the covenant at Sinai that constitutes the people as a people is based, or whatever. In particular, recalling what I was saying earlier about selective memory, I want to ask, can we remember Jerusalem without forgetting Gaza? And my response to this question can be expressed as an amendment to Psalm 137. If I remember thee, O Jerusalem, but forget Gaza, Gaza in the here and now, then let my right hand forget, etc. Or more provocatively, if I forget thee, O Gaza, then I forget Jerusalem. This I firmly believe. This conviction, this way of not forgetting the verse in Psalm 137, this way of remembering, remember, underlies the whole of my talk, which you might be relieved to know I am now ready to begin in earnest. To set the scene, I shall open with the tweet that Donald Trump tweeted last December on the subject of Jerusalem. To be frank, I am not an exponent of the art. To me, tweeting is strictly for the birds. Sorry about that. I'm told that in a tweet you have to condense a complex thought into a short text, something I've never been good at. I'm better at doing the opposite, taking a simple thought and making it into a whole Megillah. That's one difference between me and Donald Trump. The other difference is that he is in astonishingly excellent health. He is the healthiest. He is the healthiest individual in history. God, how I wish I was he. Anyway, this is what Trump tweeted on December the 6th, and I quote, I have determined that it is time to officially recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. He added, I am also directing the State Department to begin preparation to move the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Later that same day, when he repeated this announcement in a speech at the White House, he remarked, "This is nothing more or less than a recognition of reality." Really? Recognition of reality? Or a monstrous distortion of reality? When someone makes a claim about reality, it helps to have a reality check. So let us do that, going back to the British Mandate, which began in April 1920 and lasted until May the 14th, 1948, the day on which Israel declared its independence. Jerusalem under the British was the capital of the mandated territory, but as Bernard Wasserstein explains in his recent article for the Foreign Policy Research Institute, there were no embassies, only consulates in the city, as Palestine was under the control of the governing state, Britain. In other words, Palestine was not a state in its own right. It was not a sovereign state. Resolution 181, adopted by the UN General Assembly on November the 29th, 1947, envisaged two sovereign states, one Arab and one Jewish. But Jerusalem in this plan would be a part of neither, the Arab nor the Jewish state, nor both. It would be a corpus separatum, a separate body or entity administered directly by the UN. 2 years later, on December the 9th, 1949, the General Assembly voted to put this clause into effect, even though 4 days earlier, Ben-Gurion had made a preemptive strike by declaring it, in his words, null and void. As Wasserstein points out, and I quote him, the international community never recognized the partition of Jerusalem. Nevertheless, in practice, after the dust had settled on the Arab-Israeli war, the city was bisected into west and east and remained cut in two. "Oh, east is east and west is west," famously averred the English poet Rudyard Kipling, and never the twain shall meet. But with Jerusalem they did meet again in 1967 at the end of the June War, when Israel captured the eastern sector and on June the 28th formally annexed it, though I believe the term used in the legal ordinance was unification, not annexation. Not that this healed the physical division of the city between Arab and Jew, nor did it alter the status of the city in the eyes of the rest of the world, especially since East Jerusalem is part of occupied Palestinian territory. And then in 1980, the Knesset enacted the Jerusalem Law, stipulating that Jerusalem, complete and united, is the capital of Israel. That's a quote. This drew the ire of the UN Security Council, which censored Israel by 14 votes to 0, the US abstaining. And now fast forward to January 2001, to Taba, where a tentative agreement was signed between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. In the section on Jerusalem, the dual significance of the city was acknowledged with these words. Both sides accepted in principle the Clinton suggestion of having Palestinian sovereignty over Arab neighborhoods and Israeli sovereignty over Jewish neighborhoods. That's a quote. In the meantime, however, Ariel Sharon had gone walkabout on the Temple Mount, the Second Intifada had broken out, and Taba was dead in the water of Aqaba, which just about completes the reality check. Summing up, the reality is that since the end of the British Mandate, both the legal and political status of Jerusalem have been contested. The international community has rejected Israel's unilateral claim to the entire city as an integral part of its territory. Neither the UN nor any other intergovernmental body, as far as I know, has accepted that East Jerusalem is within Israel's borders, and Israel remains in illegal occupation of Palestinian territory, which includes East Jerusalem. To which we might add this: as a final status issue, the Jerusalem question belongs squarely on the negotiating table. That, in short, is the stark reality. When Trump claimed that his decision, quote, to officially recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel was, quoting again, nothing more or less than a recognition of reality, which reality exactly did he mean? Clearly not the one I have just outlined. He must have had an alternative reality in a parallel universe in mind. I don't know where, Trumpland, Mar-a-Lago, wherever. In reality, his reality is no reality. In itself, however, Trump's announcement is all too real. And it has affected the political reality on the ground, not the legal reality in the eyes of the international community. 2 weeks later, at an emergency special session, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution declaring null and void any decisions and actions which affect, quoting, the character, status, or demographic composition of Jerusalem, while 14 out of the 15 members of the Security Council voted in favor of a similar resolution. I don't need to give the name of the 15th state, the one that torpedoed the motion by exercising its veto. But within Israel, Trump's announcement has had a uniform impact across the political spectrum. At the AIPAC policy conference in Washington in March, Stav Shafir, a Labour member of the Knesset, said, and I quote her, "The embassy move is something that every Israeli is happy about. There is no left and right distinction on that. For us, Jerusalem is our capital. It's not something that is in doubt. It's just a fact." End of quote. Now, of course, there are Israelis who do dissent from that view, but she was overgeneralizing, but that's probably not false as a generalization. Thus, Trump's announcement has reinforced the confidence with which Israel digs its heels in over the Jerusalem question. His reward here on earth will not be long in coming. Yisrael Katz, the transportation minister, announced that the new train station planned for Jerusalem's Jewish quarter will be named after Trump. What awaits him in the hereafter is another matter. Now, when Shafir says it's just a fact that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, what she does with the word fact is reminiscent of what Trump does with the word reality. The word fact was bandied about quite a bit by Israeli and Jewish supporters of Trump's decision. Danny Danon, Israel's ambassador to the UN, said in December that the US had, and I quote, simply stated a fact in recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, adding, I quote again, "Jerusalem is the holiest place on earth for the Jewish people. This is a fact that simply cannot be refuted." Hold on there, Danny. One fact at a time, please. If the latter is a fact, that Jerusalem is the holiest place on earth for the Jewish people, right? It's not exactly a fact in the same sense in which it's a fact that a city is or is not the capital of a country. For one thing, there are semantic, or better, conceptual issues about who is comprised in the Jewish people and what holiest place on earth means. Besides, what bearing does this fact have on the alleged fact about Jerusalem's legal status? Well, to be fair, I interrupted Danon. Here, without pausing for breath, is the explanation that he went on to give. King David declared Jerusalem the capital of the Jewish people 3,000 years ago. Is that a fact? Or does Daniel Carman, Israel's ambassador to India, get it right when he says, and I quote him, "It is a fact that Jerusalem has been the capital of the Jewish people for 5,000 years." Considering that according to the Jewish calendar, it was only 778 years earlier that the world was created, that's a truly astounding fact. As facts go. But which is it, 3,000 or 5,000? Well, let's not quibble over a mere couple of millennia. The fact on which both Danon and Carman and countless others agree is this: Jerusalem is the capital of the Jewish people and has been for yonks. But, in fact, this fact is no fact. I hesitate to use the expression, but it is a fake fact. And you can blame my partner Reva, who's here for that little quip. If there were a fact lurking under the surface, it would be a fact about the content of certain biblical books, Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles, where the saga of King David is told. And even then, the biblical story gives no succor to the idea that the United Kingdom which David established lasted any length of time. After his grandson Rehoboam ascended the throne 60 or so years later, according to the biblical story, the kingdom split into two, north and south, and that was that. That was the end of David's United Kingdom from that day to this. In any case, biblical books are not historical works, not even if some historical events are reflected in them. And even if they are, their bearing on the political status of Jerusalem today is, to put it mildly, dubious, as is the bearing of the Iliad on the political status of Hisarlik, once known as Ilium or Troy. But the disposition of these factual claims is even worse than this. For it simply makes no sense to speak about Jerusalem as the capital of the Jewish people, any more than it would make sense to speak of London or Boston or even New York as the capital of the Jewish people. Peoples don't have capitals, states do. Unless, of course, naming the people is an elliptical way of naming the state. Conceivably, someone might say, Paris is the capital of the French people, meaning the people of France, meaning France, maybe. But even granting for the sake of argument the contentious claim that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel and has been since 1948, when the state came into existence, and even if we also granted, again for the sake of argument, the far more contentious claim that this state belongs to the Jewish people, neither of which things I do grant, right? Jerusalem cannot have been the capital of the Jewish people for longer than the 70 years of the state's existence. The so-called fact is not just fake, it is not just false. It is quite literally fantastic. And that word is going to matter as I develop the argument. But in the corridors of the Knesset, and not only there, Trump's tweet on December the 6th, recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of the state of Israel, was heard as recognition of the fact that Jerusalem is the capital of the Jewish people, and has been for 3,000 years, or up to 5,000. His intervention has reinforced the intransigence of the Israeli government and of Israeli politicians generally over the status of Jerusalem. But not only because he backed their hand by weighing in as the powerful US president, that much is obvious. That much is realpolitik. It takes place on the plane of everyday reality. The impact of what he said was much greater than this because the resonance went deeper than reality, deep into the fantastic depths where fantastic so-called facts, like the ones cited by Danon, Carmon et al., are fashioned. For it was not Haifa, nor Tel Aviv, nor Herzliya, but Jerusalem that Trump recognized, Jerusalem or Zion, the submerged volcano that is perpetually erupting, whose fantastic facts come bubbling up to the surface and harden into the discourse of political Zionism. It is the fantastic dimension of these facts that takes me into the heart of my talk. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, why Jerusalem? This is the title of a poem by Yehuda Amichai, the Israeli poet. Why, to put his question in a familiar form, is this city different from all other cities? Why, of all places, Jerusalem? He asks, with a hint of exasperation. I'm quoting him. Why not New York, with her buildings on high and burrows down below, and tunnels and lower depths from which to call out, O Lord, out of the depths have I cried unto thee. I'm glad you reacted as I did. A prospect so daft that I could not resist quoting it. And that, of course, that is Amichai's point. What is pathos in Jerusalem becomes bathos in New York. As the poem progresses, he entertains other cities in his imagination, wondering, why not them? Why Jerusalem? Here's a sample. Why not, and I'm quoting him, Petersburg with the mystery of her white nights? Why not Rome with her catacombs? Vancouver with her salmon? London with its gardens and palaces and towers and the chiming from the top of Big Ben? I think that answers itself, actually. Why not the sublime San Francisco, he asks. Why Jerusalem? Why not Paris with her squares and boulevards? Well, any Briton could explain that. The questioning goes on in this vein for 28 stanzas and ends on a wing and a prayer, with a recollection of a moment in time or out of time. He writes, and I quote, "Once I stood at the Western Wall, when suddenly a flock of startled birds soared up, shrieking and flapping their wings like bits of paper, with wishes scribbled on them. Wishes that flew out from between the massive stones and ascended on high." End of quote. Closing with this vision of an event that is at once natural and supernatural, Amichai is either reminding us why he asks, why Jerusalem, or he is giving us the answer, this is why Jerusalem, or he is abandoning the question, swept off his feet by this unaccountable outburst of birds, as much as to say, this is Jerusalem, don't ask. At the beginning of my talk, I posed the question, can we remember the past without forgetting the present? In particular, can we remember Jerusalem without forgetting Gaza? And at this point, I seem to hear a voice in the room saying impatiently something along these lines. You, meaning me, you ask this question and then you start reciting poetry. You complain about the fantastic element in political Zionism and then you give us a flight of fancy. Don't get me wrong, I like poetry. I like it precisely because it helps me escape from reality, which we all need to do from time to time, but that's also the problem with poetry. Take the poem by Amichai that you just quoted. It romanticizes Jerusalem, and this prevents us from seeing reality, the Palestinian reality. The Palestinian reality has nothing to do with our feathered friends and an old ruin of a wall. It has to do with a different wall altogether, a new wall with a different name. The apartheid wall is what some people call it. How can we remember Gaza if our heads are filled with Amichai's birds? How can we think realistically? If it's reality that we want, poetry is a problem. That's the voice I seem to hear in the room. Excuse me. I want to thank this imaginary voice for her or his imaginary interruption because it helps concentrate the mind. To this person, I also wish to say, no, poetry as such is not a problem. It depends on the poem, and it also depends on the use to which poetry is put by others. It depends on both these things. I, for one, do not find that this particular poem by Amichai dulls my senses. It tickles my fancy, yes, but more than that, it lifts up my eyes to the hills from whence I find inspiration, precisely for dealing with reality on the ground. I see this poem as being in a poetic tradition that goes back to the psalmist and the Hebrew prophets. Jerusalem or Zion is the place of which Isaiah speaks, when, proclaiming his vision of the last days, he declares, "Out of Zion shall go forth the Torah and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem." Isaiah speaks as a prophet, and these place names are terms of his art. So too with the psalmist, who conjures up the scene of lamentations by the waters of Babylon, with which Psalm 137 begins. Now, to be clear about what I am saying, the Jerusalem of the Psalms and the prophets is not imaginary, it is a real place, raised by their imagination and their words to a higher power. Their Zion lies on the horizon where heaven and earth appear to meet. Amichai, in another of his poems, expresses it this way. I quote, "Jerusalem is a port city on the shore of eternity." Isaiah would not have been ashamed to have written that line. No, it's not poetry that is the problem. I do not say that a poem cannot occlude our vision. In fact, shortly I shall say just that when I discuss another of Amichai's Jerusalem poems. But in the discourse of political Zionism, it is not the odd poem that is the problem. It's the petrification of poetry into political ideology. That is the problem. Let me illustrate the point by recalling the words of a former Prime Minister of Israel, who was also once Jerusalem's mayor. I quote him. At the 35th World Zionist Congress in June 2006, which met in Jerusalem, Ehud Olmert, I haven't quoted him yet, Ehud Olmert welcomed the delegates to the city, describing it thus, and now I quote him. "Jerusalem, which is Zion, the beating heart and the object of yearning and prayers of the Jewish people for generations." Olmert went on to say that there was a straight line between Basel, where the first Zionist Congress convened by Herzl met in 1897, and Jerusalem. He called that line the line of political Zionism. And there you have it. There is the problem. What becomes of Zion, the beating heart of the Jewish people, when it becomes a possession and is no longer an object of yearning? When it is taken by military force, when Zion is transformed from poetic trope to capital city, the capital city of the Jewish people. In her book, Booking Passage, Sidra Dekoven-Ezrahi raises and answers this question. She writes, and I quote, "When this poetic image, Zion, denies its status as poetry, it makes such claims on the political imagination that the final status of Jerusalem becomes non-negotiable." End of quote. Zion, the beating heart of the people, atrophies into a trophy which must not at any human cost to the Palestinian people or anyone else be surrendered. No, it's not poetry that is the problem. The problem is forgetting that poetry is poetry, and not political ideology written in a flowery language. If we forget this, what becomes of our minds, our hearts? In the book of Exodus, the text says that God hardened the heart of Pharaoh against the people of Israel, but we don't need God. We harden our own hearts against the Palestinian people by forgetting that our poetic heritage is poetic. By forgetting it, in other words, even as we remember it, forgetting the very thing that we remember. What I am saying can be put this way. Political Zionism is a form of fundamentalism. But if I put it that way, I need to elucidate what I mean and what I do not mean. I don't mean what probably a number of people in the room think I mean. First, let me clarify how I am using the expression political Zionism, which I've used many times already. Better still, I shall let Ehud Olmert explain, because in his address to the 35th World Zionist Congress, from which I just quoted, he put it more succinctly than I can. Olmert spoke of, and I quote him, the unification of the Jewish people with the state of Israel. This is the nub of political Zionism. The conflation of people with state, and everything that this implies. It implies that Judaism in the broadest sense, not just in the sense of a religion, is folded into the state. Political Zionism is thus the nationalization of Jewish identity. Now, when I call political Zionism fundamentalist, I do not mean that it is religious as opposed to secular. I shall try to explain what I do mean by way of commenting on the verdict that the biblical scholar Henry Wansbrough gives in his book, The Use and Abuse of the Bible. Wansbrough devotes a chapter to Zionism in which he reaches this conclusion. I quote him: "The abuse of the Bible lies in its use as a justification for a purely secular state of affairs, taking the promise made to Abraham in a fundamentalist way as the promise of a secular possession of land." End of quote. For Wansbrough, who is a Catholic priest and a Benedictine monk, the Bible is, and I quote him, a series of books showing God's way of acting or interacting with human beings whom he created in his image to complete his work. End of quote. There's an anecdote about Henry Wansbrough that I'm tempted to tell at this point, but I shall save it for the end of the talk. Now, I see his point, but the difficulty I have is that Wansbrough operates with a sharp distinction between religious and secular. And even though there are forms of Zionism that do use this distinction to describe themselves, the distinction is not all that distinct. It never was, not with Zionism, except perhaps on the sterilized margins of the movement. Zionism was always haunted by the messianic hope, the hope of redemption and return that is at the heart of the Hebrew Scriptures. Political Zionism saw itself as secularizing that hope, wresting it away from heaven, taking it out of God's hands, and putting it into Jewish hands. True, as Arthur Hertzberg points out, and I quote him, modern Zionist ideology set out to give a radically new meaning to the ancient rumor of the Messiah. But as Jacqueline Rose puts it in her book, The Question of Zion, Messianism, I'm quoting her, Messianism colors Zionism, including secular Zionism, at every turn. She calls it, in her words, the answer to a secular prayer. In a similar vein, David Grossman, speaking at the memorial for Yitzhak Rabin in 2006, said, and I quote him, "I am totally secular, and yet in my eyes the establishment and the very existence of the state of Israel is a miracle of sorts. A miracle of sorts in answer to a prayer of sorts. This is the hold of political Zionism over the hearts of its adherents, whether they remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy or eat bacon butty sandwiches on Yom Kippur." Hertzberg himself observes, and I quote him, "The very name of the movement evoked the dream of an end of days, of an ultimate release from the exile and a coming to rest in the land of Juri's heroic age." Likewise, as Rose remarks, with the very name of the nation, Israel. and not names alone. The political vocabulary of Zionism reverberates with sounds from Jewish liturgy. So, for example, Ben-Gurion declared in 1944, and I quote him, "The goal of our revolution is the complete ingathering of the exiles into a socialist Jewish state." You could almost hear revelation for revolution. The distinction between the two words is not distinct because it dissolves with that messianic phrase, ingathering of the exiles. 5 years later, speaking now as Prime Minister, Ben-Gurion wrote Psalm 137 into the Zionist script of the state. I quote, "A nation which for 2,500 years has faithfully adhered to the vow made by the first exiles by the waters of Babylon not to forget Jerusalem will never agree to be separated from Jerusalem." End of quote. A week later, he averred that, quoting again, "For the state of Israel there has always been and there always will be one capital only, Jerusalem, the eternal. Thus it was 3,000 years ago, and thus it will be, we believe, until the end of time." Thus spake Ben-Gurion almost 70 years ago, and to this day a disembodied voice continues to intone the self-same mantra on the left, on the right, uniting the ungodly and the pious. Jerusalem the eternal, until the end of time. Who speaks like this outside the enchanted haven of poetry? It's not exactly the vernacular of the secular. It is a hybrid language in which poetry is stretched on the rack of ideology and ironed out, flattened, and I call this flattening fundamentalist. I see it as a mean trick of memory played on Jerusalem, the beating heart of the Jewish people. But it is the Palestinian people who are the butt end of the joke. Some joke. What is Jerusalem? Where is Jerusalem? A port city on the shore of eternity, to quote that line from Amichai again. What sort of politics results from remembering a place that is at once terrestrial and celestial? Well, there's more than one possible answer to this question. But the answer given in political Zionism, the answer that is embodied in the institutions and practices of the State of Israel, is this: the politics of Jewish prerogative, the politics of domination and dispossession of others. If this answer goes back to 1948, it was massively reaffirmed less than 20 years later. I turn now to 1967. In another of his Jerusalem poems, Amichai calls 1967 the year of forgetting. Why, I am not sure. Was he being ironic? Maybe, I don't know. But given the way I read this poem, which I'm going to explain, I find it ironically apropos. Amichai tells of a stroll to the old city of Jerusalem on Yom Kippur. He was, he says, dressed in my dark holiday clothes. For a long time, he tells us, and I'm quoting him, I stood in front of an Arab's hole-in-the-wall shop, not far from the Damascus Gate, a shop with buttons and zippers and spools of thread, in every color and snaps and buckles. A rare light and many colors, like an open ark, meaning the cabinet in a synagogue, where the Torah scrolls are housed and which is kept open only for certain periods during the services. To go back to the poem, I told him in my heart, Amichai writes, that my father too had a shop like this, with thread and buttons. I explained to him in my heart, he continues, about all the decades and the causes and the events why I am now here, and my father's shop was buried there, and he is buried here. Now, these words spoken in his heart, are they intimations of atonement or expiation of guilt or of seeking reconciliation? But how? By words pronounced in the heart? This sounds to me more like a soliloquy than a dialogue. And without dialogue, there can be no reconciliation. When I was finished, Amichai concludes, it was time for the closing of the gates prayer, meaning Na'ilah, the final portion of the Yom Kippur service, the closing of the gates of heaven. Going back to the poem, he too lowered the shutters and locked the gate, Amichai writes, and I returned with all the worshippers home. And that's how the poem ends. The two gates seem to be closing in sync with each other, Heaven's Gate and the gate of the shop, of the Arab's hole-in-the-wall shop. But this is just a poetic conceit. When I was finished, says Amichai, not when we were finished. No business is finished between them because none was being transacted. The Arab is just an object in the poet's soliloquy. He has no voice. And you wonder, in this year of forgetting, 1967, has Amichai, even Amichai with all his poetic sensibility and warmth of humanity, which he has he forgotten something or someone, even as he seems to himself to remember him? On this question, I wish to summon the testimony of Mahmoud Darwish. I think it is fair to say that as a poet, Darwish is to Palestine what Amichai is to Israel. Both are great poets. Darwish called the Israeli-Palestinian conflict a struggle between two memories. If so, then the struggle is as uneven as the conflict, which is between a state and a stateless people. Darwish saw himself and Amichai, whose poetry he admired, as waging this struggle in their poetry. Amichai, he said, and I quote Darwish, put a challenge to me because we write about the same place. He continued, he, Amichai, wants to use the landscape and history for his own benefit, based on my destroyed identity. So we have a competition. Who is the owner of the language of this land? Who loves it more? Who writes it better? Beautifully put. But it is an odd competition where the competitors are not playing the same game exactly. For if the place they write about is the same, as Darwish says, the way each of them is placed in relation to this place could hardly be more different. The difference can be measured by the incalculable distance between two words, here and there. This makes all the difference to what the struggle between two memories means. Let me try and explain what I'm saying here. When Amichai spoke in his heart to the Arab, he explained to him, quote, again what I said earlier, why I am now here, and my father's shop was buried there, and he is buried here. Where is there and where is here in this poem? I take it that there, the there where Amichai's father's shop is buried, is Europe, specifically Germany, which is where he and his family came from in 1936, escaping the Nazis. So his here is Palestine, but Palestine renamed, Palestine reclaimed as the Jewish homeland and reconstituted as the State of Israel. The place that was once located there, far away from the country of Amichai's birth and childhood, has become here. Now with Darwish, who was born in a village in the Western Galilee, but became an exile, it is the other way round. Palestine, once his here, is now there. I Come From There is the title of one of his poems, which could almost be a direct response to Amichai. Quoting from the poem, I come from there and I have memories. Born as mortals are, I have a mother and a house with many windows. I come from there, he repeats. There, in the place that Amichai calls here. Both poems end with almost the identical word, the identical name for this same place. In Amichai's poem, the word is home, and in Darwish's it is homeland. But with this difference, the here that is Amichai's newfound home is the there that is Darwish's newly lost homeland. They write about the same place, yes, but one writes as possessor and the other as dispossessed. Amichai's here is a mythical Jewish homeland that became his actual home, whereas Darwish's there is his actual homeland from which he and his family had to flee as the Israel Defense Forces advanced in June 1948. Even the Arab with the shop lives there, not here, for he is an alien in his own land, and that's the point. This is what is missing or glossed over or hinted at and then eclipsed in Amichai's mesmerizing poem about Yom Kippur in Jerusalem in 1967. 1967. If this was, as Amichai says, the year of forgetting, it is because it was the year of remembering with a vengeance. It was the year when the floodgates of Jewish memory opened and a torrent from the past poured through, drowning the present, like the Red Sea after the children of Israel had passed safely through. It was the year when East Jerusalem, with the Temple Mount, fell into Israeli hands, and old biblical names, Judea, Samaria, Hebron, Shechem, sprang from ecstatic lips. I remember it well, for I too was caught up for a while in the mass euphoria, a kind of collective high. I forgot myself. I'm happy to report that in time I made a reasonable recovery. I only wish I could say the same for my people as a whole. In her epic book on Jerusalem, Karen Armstrong brings that intoxicating moment vividly to mind. Reading her account, I was reminded of the moment when all of Jewry seemed to link arms and dance the horror together. Religious Jews, she writes, were convinced that the redemption had begun. Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda Kook, son of the famous Avraham Kook, announced, quoting, "Under heavenly command, the Jewish people," quoting, "have just returned home in the elevations of holiness and our own holy city." That's Rabbi Tzvi Kook, but Moshe Dayan, meanwhile, an avowed secularist, stood before the Western Wall and declared, and I quote him, "We have returned to our most holy places. We have returned and we shall never leave them." Try and pick apart those statements. Either of them could have been said by the other. That's part of the argument of this whole talk. Even the urbane Abba Iban, Israel's delegate to the UN, waxed prophetic. Jerusalem, he said, and I quote him, lies beyond and above, before and after all political and secular considerations, as if he were talking about the transcendent itself, El Elyon, God on high. Levi Eshkol, the prime minister, announced that Jerusalem was, quote, the eternal capital of Israel. And on the night of Saturday, June the 10th, in this holy city that lies beyond and above the mundane, the 619 inhabitants of the Maghribi quarter were given 3 hours to evacuate their homes. Then the mechanical caterpillars moved in, reducing the district to rubble. This was done to create a plaza to accommodate Jewish pilgrims to the Western Wall. That was the official reason. But if you look closely, you could see the Messiah entering Jerusalem riding on the back of a bulldozer rather than a donkey in the vision of the prophet Zechariah. We live in the end time when the bulldozers, under heavenly command, do not cease from doing their divine work, manufacturing rubble from Palestinian homes. Jerusalem, Jerusalem. When I look back at 1967 and when I look around me today, I wonder whether an entire people, my people, have not fallen victim to the dreaded Jerusalem syndrome. That mysterious condition which attacks the nervous system of the sanest of people, depriving them of their grip on reality. People who previously were sound of mind and spoke politely and wanted a better world for all, a world where children did not fear the screams of overhead jets, where one day a wolf and a lamb might dwell together and a little child from Gaza will lead by example by feeling safe. Poor Isaiah, how he must be turning in his grave. The psalmist, I fancy, would relish the chance to rewrite that line in Psalm 137, bringing it up to date. If only we could forget you, O Jerusalem, if only, then maybe we might be able to remember you. One last section. What might remembering Jerusalem mean? What form might it take if it did not take the form of Jewish exceptionalism, the form it takes today? I believe it would mean what I take Isaiah's vision to imply, inclusiveness. Inclusiveness of a kind that is conducive to peace, which means sharing the land somehow, and also sharing words, the words that mean so much to us, words like return and home, and which mean as much to them as much more, given the circumstances today. Let us suppose that Darwish did read Amicai's poem about Yom Kippur in Jerusalem in 1967. How would he have been affected by that final line? And I returned with all the worshippers home. Home, returned. What heartache Darwish would have felt as he read those comforting words. These are also the words that the protesters from Gaza have been using on their weekly March of Return, which began 6 weeks ago and originally was scheduled to end today, Friday, May the 4th. They have been chanting not a psalm but a lullaby by the late Palestinian poet Ibrahim Mohammed Saleh Abu Arab. I will return to my country, to the green land I will return. Return where? There. Transforming there into here. This is what remembering Jerusalem might mean. And there's only one way this can be done, and that's by changing them into us. Not changing who they are, but changing their status so that they are no longer the negative to the Jewish positive. So that the first person plural, us, becomes inclusive. What was that harsh thing that Darwish said about Amicai? I'll quote it again. He wants to use the landscape and history for his own benefit based on my destroyed identity. Or whether this is entirely fair to Amakai, it is the brutal truth, notwithstanding any pious or liberal caveats, about political Zionism. Political Zionism is essentially a supersessionary project. It seeks to take the land away from one people and replace them with another. Israel, you might say, is the negation of Palestine. Defining itself as the Jewish state, it defines itself as not Palestine. This method of definition, defining your group by negating another, ought to ring a bell in Jewish ears. An alarm bell. And just at that moment, my hearing aid came out. That's really strange. Makes me wonder whether someone on high isn't looking down. Let me say again, this method of definition, defining your group by negating another, ought to ring a bell in Jewish ears, an alarm bell. It is the essence of the othering of the Jews of Europe down the centuries. Ab initio, from the beginning, the church announced to the world that it was precisely not the synagogue, and the die was cast. What began in antiquity became an inveterate habit written into Europe's cultural DNA. At first the foil to Christianity, the Jew became the foil to humanity in the universalism of the 18th century Enlightenment, and then the foil to the ethnic nation in the 2 centuries that followed. A saga that culminated in the Shoah which led inexorably to the Nakba. That's the point. I am a Jew, to recall Hilda's words, with a profound consciousness of Jewish victimization through history. But for me, she might have gone on to say, to remember the Shoah but forget the Nakba is inconceivable. It is certainly unconscionable, as the two events are inextricably linked. The Jewish pariah of Europe has metamorphosed into the Palestinian pariah of Israel. You shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the feelings of the stranger, having yourselves been strangers in the land of Egypt. Exodus 23:9. According to a Baraita, a late tradition in the Talmud, the Torah repeats this injunction or words to similar effect between 36 and 46 times, depending on how you count. How many times does it need to be said? And how hard is it to translate into an injunction that applies to a people which identifies with the people to whom that injunction in the book is addressed? It's not that difficult. Let me try my hand at doing the translation. You shall not turn another people into the other, for you know the feelings of the other, having yourselves been othered in the land of Europe. The memory of otherness, this is the rock on which Judaism, my Judaism, is built. A state that does not remember this, but calls itself Jewish, forgets itself. When I contemplate this collective self-forgetting, a people that has forgotten its soul, then I am transported back in time, 2,500 years, in fact, sitting with the psalmist, weeping by the waters of Babylon. Now, in a way, everything I've said is just a preamble to the $64 question, what kind of political future for Palestine and Israel does the principle of inclusiveness imply? And I owe you an answer to this question. Unfortunately, or do I really mean that, I'm out of time. Now, we can, if people want, broach the political question in the discussion period. In the meantime, in place of an answer, I have an anecdote, the anecdote with which earlier I said I would close. So this is my final lap. Oxford is overwhelmingly Anglican, but St. Benet's Hall, my college, is Catholic. And until recently, it was always headed by a monk from Ampleforth Abbey. How come a nice Jewish boy like me ends up at such a place? Well, since you ask, I'll tell you. The year was 1998. I had just finished a 6-year stint as head of the Department of Philosophy at St. Xavier University in Chicago, which was founded by the Sisters of Mercy, an order of Catholic nuns. That's relevant. I was due 1 year's sabbatical leave, and after consulting a colleague at Oxford, I wrote to St. Benet's. Did they have a vacancy for a residential visiting fellow? My inquiry was addressed to the master, who at the time was Father Henry Wansborough, the aforementioned author of the book, The Use and Abuse of the Bible, that I discussed. In his reply, Father Henry thoughtfully explained what I was getting into. Basically, he wrote, and I'm quoting him, "It is a Benedictine house and we live as a monastic community." He went on to say cordially that I would be most welcome to come and live with them for a year. Well, I read this reply with a mixture of relief and anxiety. On the one hand, this was what I was hoping he would say. On the other hand, how come he said it? Probably, I thought, Father Henry, seeing that I'm at St. Xavier, has assumed I am Catholic. I didn't want to accept his offer on false pretenses, but neither did I wish to lose it. So, feeling as if I were treading on eggshells, I wrote back as follows: Dear Father Henry, and this is a quote from the email I sent him in 1998. Since my own upbringing, it's terribly stilted, and I feel embarrassed reading this out, but I want to. Since my own upbringing and education was religious, I am accustomed to an environment that combines the academic with the devotional. It's painful, isn't it? However, I added, taking a deep breath and breaking the news as gently as I could, my affiliation is not Catholic, nor even Christian, but Jewish. I then pointed out what that implied. Consequently, I suppose I will not be able to participate fully in all the rituals that are part of the life of the community at St. Benet's. I quickly added, while this doesn't pose a problem for me, I do see that this might not be what the hall has in mind for a visiting fellow, especially one who is living on the premises. To this ponderous, not to say convoluted message, I received the following response. Now, bear in mind that Father Henry is not only a monk and a priest, but also editor of the Catholic New Jerusalem Bible, and at the time was a member of the Pontifical Biblical Commission. He wrote, and I quote, "My mother was Jewish. I have an array of Jewish cousins and value highly the Jewish tradition. I love all things Jewish." And then he qualified this, pointedly but with British understatement, with certain limitations about Netanyahu. Had it not been for the limitations about Netanyahu, I might have thought twice about his offer. As it was, I did not need to think once. I accepted, I came, and he and I became friends, and we still are. During that first year, at several late-night assignations lubricated by an ecumenical bottle of single malt scotch, I learnt that there was more to Henry's Jewishness than just his mother and his cousins. He did not and does not see his Jewish identity as superseded. He was fond of saying that he and I were the only two Jews in the hall, which at the time was true, not now. As I got to know him better, I discovered that this was not a throwaway line, any more than his Jewishness was a throwaway identity, which prompts in closing the following thought. Catholic and Jewish, two identities that seem mutually incompatible, a relationship fraught with conflict and pain, a deeply troubled history that has gone on for so long that it makes friction between Arabs and Jews seem like a blip in time. If these two identities can meet in one person and peacefully coexist, if Henry can be the one without forgetting he is, so to speak, the other, then there is hope yet for Jerusalem. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian, for that wonderful, wonderful presentation. We will take questions, and if you have a question, I will hand you the mic. I'll start with you.
Hello, thank you for this wonderful talk. I wanted to ask about how Zionism changes the way Arabs and Jews have interacted pre the establishment of Israel. It seems like they forget, you use forgetting a lot, it seems like in Zionism they forget all the mutual times that they've lived together in Spain, in North Africa, in Egypt, and all the times that when Salah ad-Din, for example, reclaimed Jerusalem from the Crusaders, he welcomed the Jews back because Muslims have always acknowledged the link between Jews and Jerusalem. How do you think that they've changed that? And when I say they, I mean Zionism.
Well, let me say why I welcome that question. Oh, maybe I should just do this. Let me say why I welcome that question, because I've just given a talk on memory. And you have just reminded us, right, of something that tends to get forgotten in the telling of the story as we have it today about relations between Arabs and Jews. The story and between Muslims and Jews, right? The story that's told leaves certain things out and emphasizes others. And I think that the answer to your question is that what's happened is that a set of political circumstances combined with a political ideology, a political Zionism, has tended to erase the memory of the periods that you're talking about. Not that those periods were golden, not that we should idealize them, but there is something about remembering them that would help us keep our heads today. Now, I want to, if I may, build on that, because it's not only a question of political Zionism. It's a question of a history in which Europe has a very heavy responsibility to bear on the way it has interfered, if you like, with relations between Arabs and Jews and between Muslims and Jews. So we also had a situation in the French colonial empire in the 19th century when there were measures that were taken in Algeria, in the French Maghreb, that discriminated in favor of Jews over and against Muslims. In fact, Jewish Arabs, right, over and against Muslim Arabs, which has contributed to tensions today in France of the sort that you're referring to, which is the relations between Muslims and Jews and between Arabs and Jews. And I won't take it further than that. I'm using that just as an example to illustrate the extent to which behind this story is Europe. Europe has an immense responsibility because of the way it has conducted itself in the affairs of other peoples around the world, and the way in which it has treated its own internal other, the Jew, down the centuries. So I welcome your question because I think what you're doing is reminding us of something that we should be remembering, and which, if we remembered, would help tell against the kind of binary opposition between Jew and Arab and between Jew and Muslim that we see today.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. I'm here. I was interested in your distillation of fundamentalism and the use of that word. And I wondered if I could ask you to extrapolate your application of what is fundamentalism, or how does it shake out to something beyond Judaism, other fundamentalisms?
Well, that's an excellent question, and I accept that I have invited it, which doesn't mean that I can answer it. But one way in which I want to approach this question is to say that the way we think and talk about fundamentalism tends to be slotted in to a binary that is part of sort of modernity and modern thinking between religious and secular. And because if you operate with that distinction, if you start out by saying there's the religious and there's the secular is enlightened, the religious is benighted, then fundamentalism is only ever going to be a characteristic of the secular. Then we won't recognize it when it, of the religious, I mean. Then we won't recognize it when it appears within so-called secular thought. So what I'm trying to do here is to start the process of questioning the distinction that lies behind our tending to think that fundamentalism is a property only of religious thought and not a secular thought. Other examples, I mean, people in the room may be able to provide other examples. I do think that political Zionism isn't going to be the only example of what I'm calling fundamentalist thinking. And once again, let me just remind myself and everybody else what I am calling fundamentalist thinking. It's a kind of thinking in which all, if you like, literary genres are flattened out and treated as though they were just variations on the same theme of ideology, political ideology, so that there's no distinction between the different registers of meaning that exist with different kinds of text. The religious fundamentalist does that in an obvious way by taking a sacred book and treating it as though it were a blueprint for thinking about the here and now that you could apply somehow directly, or some people would say literally, though that's a problematic word for me. But I think you can find the same thing with certain forms of nationalism that take poetry. Let's say it's poetry about the forests of Bavaria. Right? I'm just taking this at random off the top of my head. And you can see how that kind of language, that kind of poetry, which could be actually very lovely and inspiring in its own right, can be pressed into the service of a nationalist political ideology. That would be another example of what I mean by fundamentalism.
Other questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm curious about your construct of reality. And if I understood you correctly, it sounds like reality is facts. And I don't mean that it should be non-facts. And I think I understand what you're saying about poetry being called into service for nationalism. But I'm curious, do we know that reality is simply facts? Do we know that the fantastic isn't actually part of reality?
Well, first of all, I should clarify that I didn't intend to put forward a theory of reality, but rather a critique of the way that word was being used by Donald Trump. Since he made a claim about recognizing reality, what I wanted to do was to subject that claim to a test. And so the reality check that I was making was based, you're quite right about this, was based on an idea of reality as consisting of something like facts, political facts, legal facts, physical facts. You're absolutely right about that. But I believe that in doing so, I was only responding, right, to the way he was using the word. In fact, I very much agree with the implication of your question, and in a sense, it's what I've been arguing, I think, in this lecture, that what we think of as fantasy becomes part of reality. It enters into our lives, the way we behave, the way we see things, the way we react. And so a larger theory of reality would have to accommodate, right, what I was calling fantasy. So I hope that clears up the point.
Hi. I have a question that may seem foolish and fantastical. We're in, as you said, this moment in time when there have been the marches every Friday in Gaza, where the demonstrators have been shot, and we're coming up to May 14th, May 15th, Nakba Day, which we know is people in Israel, it's against the law to celebrate Nakba Day. We also know that the U.S. has declared they're going to open the U.S. Embassy on Nakba Day. And it looks like there could be a confluence of dangerous forces that day. And yet, in my heart, I can't help but think that there may be ways that we can actually ameliorate this and make it not as awful as it could be. Trump has been, seems to me to be a reflection of who we are in many ways. He's been on both sides of this issues. And I'm wondering if you have any suggestions or anyone else about what we might be able to do at this point in time to make the 15th and before and after better than worse. Thank you.
Well, let me just say, first of all, that's far from being a foolish question. I mean, it's a very, the question you raise is about a very serious issue that is coming up soon, and it's important to remind us of that when we're thinking and talking about poetry and fantasy and so on, that there is a confrontation coming up in 2 weeks' time, less than 2 weeks' time. And so I think you're quite right to raise it. I wish I had some kind of answer to this, but I don't see any alternative to a future in which this sort of confrontation will continue to happen unless and until certain more fundamental things change. And I do think this country has, and has for a long time, had a major role to play in this. But if you'll allow me speaking as a foreigner, to say, I think that the United States has simply failed to perform the role that it should be playing. Because by reinforcing, and Trump's tweet is just an example, another example, it's nothing new really, another example of the United States using its power and influence to reinforce intransigence on the part of the state of Israel. And the conflict is ultimately, as I said in my talk, between a state and a stateless people. In such a conflict, if anyone should have their hand reinforced, it should be the stateless people, not the state. And if you keep reinforcing the hand of the state, how can one expect anything else other than these conflicts to continue unless Palestinians stop remembering who they are, stop wanting to return home, give up their hopes and ideals beyond the extent to which they have already compromised on the original sort of investment in the land? So I wish I had a better answer to give you, but I think that the way things are at the moment, there is a kind of inertia that will persist unless there is some external intervention to change it. Now, as I said, I'm no political scientist, I'm not an international relations expert, but this seems to me to be a conflict where you need an external party to intervene in order to change things. I do not see in Israel itself a dynamic in that direction. In fact, the more time goes by, it seems the weaker becomes, unfortunately, sadly, the voice of those people who would not, who are not caught up in the whole sort of ideology that I've been talking about. Worse than that, you've seen the rise of the right, the religious, but not only the religious right. I mean, Netanyahu is not, I wouldn't call him part of the religious right. But the rise of the right in Israel has tended to reinforce this status quo. So the whole situation is stuck in a terrible rut. And I think that the kind of thinking that would be needed is not something that can happen between now and May the 14th and the 15th of this year. But let me piggyback on your question and just say a little bit about a project that I was engaged in for several years. And I think Sarah might have mentioned it in her introduction. And this was a project of engagement between Arabs and Jews that was conducted under the auspices of the Bruno Kreisky Forum in Vienna. We met, I think, twice a year for several years. And that process of engagement between us, which will bear fruit in a book that will be coming out next year, did change minds and hearts. There's no question. I mean, when we came, there was a tendency for the Jews to sort of feel they're Jews and the Arabs to feel that they're Arabs. And I tell you what, by the way, what began to alter that. In the early meetings, the Arab members of the Arab and Jewish Engagement Project would meet separately, the Jewish members would meet separately, but there were one or two people like Gil Anajar who said, well, actually, I don't know which group I should be in because I'm Arab and I'm Jewish. I'm both. And that was like a kind of catalyst, began to affect everybody as the two identities that had been brought in as if they were totally distinct and even opposed, suddenly seemed to melt. And that's, of course, what I was trying to do with the example of Father Henry Wansborough at the end, using Catholic and Jewish as two identities. Sometimes when one individual represents or accomplishes a kind of union of two identities in herself or in himself, that can begin to break the ice. And by the end of the project, there was really no sense of it being two sides who needed to make the imaginative leap to understand each other. We were all involved together in the same project. That brings me back to your question. What is that project? It's the project that I was trying to imply by the use of the word inclusiveness. Two of the members of the group, Bashir and Amos Goldberg, have published an article in which they talk about this. And the phrase they use, but it's easy to misunderstand it, so I'm going to use the phrase and then quickly try and elucidate it. The phrase they use for the project of coming together so as to avoid the kind of thing that will happen, unfortunately, right, in 2 weeks' time and again 6 months later or whatever it is, the phrase they use is binational thinking. They don't necessarily mean a binational state. What they mean is a kind of thinking in which the two peoples are thought about together in the same bracket, and their joint future becomes the project. How can we think of a future that will accommodate both peoples, instead of thinking of it as a conflict between two identities with a zero-sum game? So by binational, what they mean is not necessarily a single binational state. They say explicitly in their article that there are a number of different constitutional arrangements that could reflect the kind of thinking that they mean, which could be from, we talk about one state or two states, that's so narrow because there are lots of different constitutional possibilities, federations, confederations, unions, all sorts of things. Their point is, and my point in response to you is, that the only way in which that confrontation will not occur is when people approach the situation in Palestine and Israel thinking binationally, thinking with both peoples in the same bracket instead of thinking of one versus the other. And I'm afraid that the prospect of that happening soon is not terribly great. And by and large, people outside of the area don't help because so many people are partisan. So many people side with one side versus the other. And I think it would begin to help if there could be a politics outside of the Middle East, a politics that was promoting this kind of binational thinking. And that's why I thought that the Bruno Kreisky Forum, actually, in Vienna, are to be congratulated on taking the initiative that they took. I'm sorry, I've given a rather longer answer than you probably needed.
I think this is working. Thank you for so many provocative and, in many ways, devastating thoughts. In asking this question, I want to invoke the spirit of Hilda, who really brought a tremendous sort of depth of ethical thinking to her activism. I mean, she was not an activist ethicist, she was really an ethical activist and embodied that for me and for many other people. You described really vividly the kind of cynical deployment of poetry and scripture that political Zionism, really from its inception, has rested on. I mean, from the naming of the state to all kinds of linguistic tropes and, colors, and it's all been sort of with a nod to a religious history or to religious tradition. As an activist, Jewish, sometimes trying to talk to Jews about this topic, I am often moved to do the same. And I wonder, from a Jewish ethical point of view, if you can talk about to what degree we want to be sort of instrumentalist in using that language and in invoking that kind of poetry and scriptural heritage as well, or whether we have a sort of higher calling to be a little more honest than that.
Well, another excellent question, and there's a lot to be said about that. But let me begin just by picking up, if I may, on the use of the word cynical, because I think it's true that a cynical use has been put. The literature we're talking about has been put to a cynical use. But a lot of the time, I think it's not so much cynicism as a kind of enthusiasm. It's what you get when people are carried away with an idea or with an identity, and it's a combination of the two. So you have people who are manipulating the tradition, and there are other people who are easily manipulated because there is something real at the level of fantasy, as it were, in their hearts to which this language appeals. Exactly, and so am I. And that's what I was wanting to emphasize. That's why at the beginning of the talk I wanted to spend a little bit of time on clarifying my voice, because I'm not coming from a place of alienation from Judaism and from Jewish identity, or quite the contrary. And I see this as a matter of reclaiming that identity, because I've come to see it, not something that I originally thought, but I've come to see political Zionism as a movement aimed in a way against two peoples, appropriating the land of the Palestinians and appropriating the identity of Jews. I also think it's a very understandable thing. If you look at Jewish history and recent Jewish historical experience, which I've hardly spoken about in this talk, and that's a hole in my talk because it needs to be talked about, you can understand it. You can understand why people would be willing to embrace a movement even at the cost of someone else. Doesn't justify it. It doesn't make it acceptable on Jewish terms. And there were Zionist thinkers who never accepted it. Ahad Ha'am, for example, I published a book of his essays, and he made it very clear in his writing that the use of violence at all in Palestine was a betrayal of what he regarded right as Zionism. He was also someone, in his essay in 1920, after the Balfour Declaration, he put forward something like a proposal for a binational state. That wasn't the phrase he used, but something like that. He's a man who is remembered today in Israel as an icon, and there are streets named after him in every major Israeli town. So it's not as if this is something which is inevitable, even with Zionism. But he, amongst many others, I mean, he was drawn to the movement before the terrible events of the 20th century, but nonetheless with a background of anti-Semitism in Europe that was devastating. And without that, if you ask me, none of this would have happened. That's what I meant, part of what I meant earlier when I said Europe has a heavy responsibility to bear. Even Herzl, in Der Judenstaat, predicates his argument on anti-Semitism in Europe. I mean, there's a lot more to be said about that. It's not that simple. My point is that it's understandable that people are susceptible, but it's not acceptable because the consequences are that you have systematic, institutionalized injustice against another people, so that our experience of othering in Europe becomes inflicting othering on Palestinians, actually on Arabs in general, because the racism, unfortunately, the anti-Arab racism that has become part and parcel of so much discourse in Israel, it goes way beyond just the Palestinians. But the Palestinians in particular, because their claim to the land directly stands in the way, right, of the claim to the land that is being made in this ideology, and being made in the name of this kind of literature to which you and I resonate. So I think it's completely appropriate to go back to those sources and to bring them in. That's my view. Because in a way, it's an act of resistance. In a way. It's a way of saying, I do not accept that my heritage can be claimed by this movement, and that in the name of that heritage, this kind of politics can be pursued. So if you're asking me, I said at the beginning, you know, I'm speaking as a Jew, and I try to explain what I meant by that. It's not just a kind of incidental identity. But of course, there are also universal considerations. You don't need to necessarily draw on the well of Judaism. But if you are someone who is so formed, then I think it's completely appropriate to do so.
Brian, I would like to ask you something. If the two poets you quoted, Amichai and Darwish, were sitting in a room together, across a table from each other, what do you think they would say to each other?
I'm trying to think of the name of the best dramatist to write this play. Because what you've just spoken about is surely the premise of a play. And actually, I think it's a brilliant idea. And I am not the person who is able to deliver the goods, but I think someone should write this play. Because we're talking about two people of exceptional sensibility, and both of them had a wonderful feel for language. And, Darwish was younger, much younger, but nonetheless, it wouldn't have surprised me if Amichai would have respected Darwish just as Darwish respected Amichai's poetry. I think it would be fascinating to see a dialogue between them. My guess is that it would not go easily. My guess is that it would be fraught. But that if they were both to exercise their powers of poetry in the dialogue, and this is what the play could perhaps bring out, eventually their ear could not help but be bent by the other. That's what I would like to think.
As would I. Other questions?
Thanks. Among other things, I think you made a great case that philosophers, in fact, do know things worth knowing. That philosophers, despite what you said at the beginning, do know things worth knowing. But what I wanted to ask is, you know, if you have a people who self-identify with a particular identity and aspire to a land, how could things have been done differently than political Zionism?
I think that, first of all, thank you for that quip about philosophers. How could it have been done differently? I think that the possibilities in theory were quite varied. There was, in fact, a movement within Zionism itself for a binational state. It wasn't the case until close towards the end. Even Ben-Gurion at one point was willing to contemplate that as a possibility. It wasn't, in other words, built into Zionist aspirations, even Zionist political aspirations, that there had to be a Jewish state in Palestine, let alone a Jewish state that occupied the whole of the Mandate territory. So I think that if you're asking the question politically, the answer is there always were, and there still are, different constitutional arrangements that could be made in that territory that would accommodate everybody who lives there. I think the question becomes, how do you achieve that? And you never get to that question if you're only thinking, you know, in terms of your own people and their aspiration. The binational position was admittedly a minority position within the Zionist movement, but very distinguished figures within Zionism, like Martin Buber, like Judah Magnus. And I mentioned Ahad Ha'am, but that's a bit of a slightly different case because it's a little anachronistic to talk about him in that way. Nonetheless, there were figures within the movement who were pushing for a different kind of solution to the conflict between political aspirations within Palestine. So I guess that's my answer. I think in principle, there was another way of moving ahead.
Yes.
Hi, thanks so much for the talk. I thought it was great. I was just wondering how you would distinguish between personal memory and collective memory. You talked about how we need to share words like return and the land, but where's the distinction when it's someone who has a personal memory of their home and being removed from their home and their land, and then a people who have a collective memory from whatever 3,000 years ago to the return to the land?
I mean, ultimately, even collective memory can only exist through individuals. So there's a sense in which, because there is no entity that constitutes a collective is, by definition, a plural. That's what the word itself suggests. So you always, in the end, go back to individuals who are remembering. And what are they remembering? They could be remembering personal experience. They could be remembering family experience that has been told to them by their grandparents and by their great-grandparents. They could be remembering texts and books that they studied. They could be remembering any kind of current that flows into the present from the past. I would say that although in one sense it's inevitable that collective memory will reside in individuals, in another sense it's a task that one has to achieve to make that collective memory individual or not accept it, change it. Because otherwise, although there is no real entity that is collective, it is possible for a kind of collective self to inhabit the individual heart and the individual mind. So that's why I was saying at the beginning that in order to acquire your own voice, it's necessary to go back to revisit those thoughts, those ideas, those memories that you imbibed when you were young from all the grown-ups around you, and then determine, are they mine or are they not mine? So there's a dialectic between the collective and the individual when it comes to memory.
Other questions?
You mentioned the word reality many times.
Yes.
And I don't want to take sides, turn it into a political debate about who's right and who's wrong. But in reference to reality, since Hamas seems to rule the streets, if not the minds of the Gazans entirely, tell me what you think of the reality of the charter. To the best of my knowledge, it does not recognize Israel as a reality. And I know they've recently changed their charter. They've taken out some of the most horrific statements, from my reading at least, references to seek out Jews from behind every stone and stone them to death. They left out those hyperbolic comments, but they just talk still about returning to Haifa, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and all the land, and Israel, the Jews eventually not having any space in what currently is Israel. How does one approach it? I mean, that is a reality. That is the reality of the charter that controls thinking of many of the Gazans. Could you address that issue?
There's not, excuse me, I don't really feel too equipped to talk about Hamas, but I would say a couple of things which I think have a bearing on the question that you've raised. One is that even when a Palestinian political body does recognize Israel, as the PA did in 1988, it hasn't seemed to make hasn't made much difference to the way Israel as a state behaves towards its Palestinian population, whether within the Green Line or on the other side of the Green Line. So you have a state of affairs where recognition of political reality on the part of the Palestinians doesn't appear to bring any kind of premium. That's one point I would make. The second is that I think we have to distinguish here between political statements and political behavior. Hamas obviously does recognize the existence of the State of Israel. I mean, by its behavior. It's impossible not to. If you're in Gaza, how could you not be aware that Israel is real? Not recognizing the right, if you like, of the state is a political position that is taken, rightly or wrongly, whether it is wise to or not, for political reasons. Hamas has seen the PA concede on that ground, and as I say, it didn't achieve anything for the Palestinian cause. So, although I can't say anything more about Hamas, as I said at the beginning, it wouldn't surprise me if there is a political motive behind this. It's not just a question of not recognizing reality. It's a question of making a political judgment, good one or bad one, not to concede the point in public.
Over here. Look, I basically would like to see a binational or multinational state emerge, but I'm actually from a binational state, Canada, and I can tell you that they're dangerous, fragile, and liable to break down in very bad ways. If you look at Rwanda, Yugoslavia, Syria, you could argue, I think you get the picture. So one of the things you want, and which is really almost required, is at least the perception that your regional neighbors are strongly committed to seeing that state work out peacefully as opposed to liable to take one side or another if things start to break down. And I see changes in the Middle East towards that, but the outcome is not clear. So I think one of the reasons this Hamas issue has come up is that it's not just the PLO's adjustment that's critical, but the adjustment of the wider region. So would you care to comment on that?
I'm sure you're right, and this is where I do feel I'm bumping up against the limits of my competence. I'm sure you're right that the wider region's attitudes are crucial. After all, Palestine and Israel don't exist in a vacuum. By the same token, having said that, and conceding that I'm really not able to speak to this at any length because I don't have the kind of training and knowledge, it does strike me that when the region has attempted, I mean, I'm thinking in particular now of Arab states in the region, when they've attempted to promote a solution to this, and I'm thinking of the Saudi initiative, right? It didn't go anywhere. See, I think that maybe this is naive on my part. I'm prepared to accept that. But I think that there's a role for an external party, and it ought to be, ideally, the United Nations. In the absence of the United Nations, because unfortunately the UN that we have today is not what it should be, the mantle falls on someone else. And the US is the obvious country to step up to the plate, and doesn't. So although I very much take your point that it would, in the long run, require a regional attitudinal change, when the region has tried, when Arab states in the region have tried to make that, take that step, it didn't change anything in the thinking of the state of Israel. And I'm inclined to think that's because there needs to be an external power that puts enough pressure on the region, not only on Israel, that would make that happen. And I just don't see that happening today. So I feel a bit bereft. Yes.
First, a fact
Yes.
about Hilda that relates to your talk.
Yeah.
She worked with a mixed group of people on a book called When the Rains Return, which was an attempt to cross barriers. A very powerful book. But then a challenge. You used metaphors very well, quoting the two poets. Can you construct a metaphor for the vision of Israelis on the border facing Gazans at the fence? What is in their minds?
I don't know. I mean, you're talking about the soldiers themselves.
Well, the folks that are in the Negev that are within maybe 10 or 20 miles of the border.
Yeah. What seems to be in their minds is this. Over there on the other side of the border is our enemy. And our enemy, unlike us, is not civilized, is not minded towards peace. This was what seems to be in the minds of the people that you're talking about. I don't have a metaphor for this, but I think that there's something very rotten in a state that cultivates this mentality in its young.
Brian, we've run out of time. I want to thank you very much for a very compelling, very thoughtful, and very poignant presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.